The attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon on September the 11th, 2001 inaugurated a new era of American politics and prompted conservative soul-searching about how best to respond to new threats. Those with an historical view could, however, take consolation from the fact that the nation had now endured for more than 200 years with a constitution that was durable enough, but also adaptable enough, to change with the changing times, never breaking down and never succumbing to revolution. British Conservatives too could take pleasure in the capacity of their own system, hammered out in the conflicts of the 17th century, to remain viable in the 21st. Part of the unspoken awareness of Anglo-American conservatives was that nearly all their domestic antagonists, whether liberal or socialist, were also dedicated to preserving these constitutional arrangements. Neither country had ever given rise to a significant revolutionary movement. Communism had been extremely weak and ineffectual in both, and was now extinct. In other words, conservatives nearly all enjoyed a high measure of consensus, even with their ostensible adversaries, and enjoyed the benefits of life in what might be thought of as a broadly conservative environment. How they should react to new challenges remained a question of vital concern. But Anglo-American conservatives, whatever their short-term anxieties, had reason to approach the future in a mood of quiet confidence. Now, I've declined or decided to not talk in detail about the conservative politics of the years since 2000 because of their proximity and because of their intensely controversial character. This course has been designed for listeners and viewers from every point on the political spectrum, and I'd be very sorry to lose you after such a long journey by voicing opinions or judgments about recent events with which you violently disagreed. Historians prefer to take the long view and to leave current events to the journalists. There are certainly plenty of intensely divisive questions we might ask. Were the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq consonant with conservatism? Well, of course, I'm giving nothing away in saying that some people said yes. The authors of Present Dangers, for example, had been advocating a forward foreign policy, whereas others said no, particularly the paleo-conservatives, and both groups had got plausible arguments to offer in support of their ideas. What about the massive federal loans given to failing banks in the fall and early winter of the year 2008? Was there anything conservative about that, even though it was done under a conservative government? Does 2008 in fact mark the fall of free market capitalism, just as 1991 marked the fall of communism? These are questions which historians will dispute in the coming decades. It's unlikely that the election results of 2008 had a shattering effect on conservatism, even if its consequences for particular political groupings in America were severe. Conservatism as an attitude, a frame of mind, persists through all transient crises of circumstances. And as I've tried to emphasise throughout this course, conservatism is reactive to circumstances. Sharp changes of electoral fortunes have led to shifts before, and the aftermath of the election of 2008 will almost certainly lead to a lot of rethinking once again. Recent developments in Britain suggest a comparable story there. In Britain, the Conservative Party has been out of office since 1997. Although John Major won the election of 1992, he then lost to Tony Blair in the election of 97. And the Conservative Party have been out of office ever since. First Tony Blair and now Gordon Brown have been in power instead. But ironically, this is partly because the Labour Party itself reformed its constitution in the 1990s and finally sloughed off its claim to be a socialist party, and in doing so became much more acceptable to property-owning conservatives in Britain. So that ironically, it was certainly imaginable that many British people of conservative temperament, property owners, might vote Labour. During the 1980s, under Margaret Thatcher, the Labour Party had had a series of weak leaders. First, Michael Foot, a brilliant historian, but not at all the type of person suitable to lead a nation. Then Neil Kinnock, who was unkindly nicknamed the Welsh windbag, not at all the equal of Lloyd George, the great Welsh Prime Minister of the early 20th century. The Labour Party in the 80s and early 90s had been cursed by its too close association with powerful trade unions that were increasingly seen as enemies of progress and obstacles to industrial modernisation. And it had continued to assert, ever since the days of the First World War, in Clause 4 of its constitution, that it favoured the displacement of capitalism by socialism. It had always been a procedural parliamentary party. It had always intended to do it peacefully, but nevertheless that had been the ultimate intention. Margaret Thatcher began dismantling socialism internally, and the end of the Soviet Empire did the rest. By the early 90s, socialism and communism were in almost total discredit. The 1994 revision of Labour's constitution eliminated the socialist pledge and at once made the party far more acceptable to the property-owning middle classes. People now vote Labour who prosper but have active social consciences. And it's been the great genius of Tony Blair as the leader to convey a sense of modernity, confidence, moderation and efficient capability. That, plus an almost sustained economic boom from the mid-90s up to the year 2008, gave the Labour Party its most successful run ever, including 3 consecutive election victories, which followed the 4 consecutive Tory victories of the 1980s and early 90s. Even so, the nature of a two-party system makes a revival in the fortunes of the Conservative Party in the near future extremely probable. The Conservative Party went through some dreadful times in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, comparable to the kind of disarray that Labour had found itself in the 1980s. But as I mentioned in one of the earlier lectures, the party in power always takes responsibility for whatever goes wrong, just as it takes credit for whatever goes right. And that means that an accumulation of grievances with the party that's been in power for a long time, plus that party's own tendency to take itself for granted and its favoured position, nearly always prompts a swing of the pendulum. Certainly a study of either British or American political history over the last 2 centuries would encourage the idea that parties out of power can reasonably expect to get into power, except under the gravest crises where parties break up altogether, as had the Whigs in the 1850s or the British Liberal Party at the time of the First World War. Well, historians more than anybody else know that we can't predict the future. But it's reasonable to say that anything so durable as the Conservative attitude to life and its political expression is likely to persist, especially in these nations where it's been so carefully built into the institutions themselves. One theme that's come through in the lectures about British conservatism, I hope, is its extraordinary adaptability to changing times and circumstances. And although I haven't said very much about them, the same is also true of Canada, Australia and New Zealand, with their majority populations which also come from British origins. Way back in the 1770s, certainly the great hope of the American revolutionaries was that the Canadians would join in, and they even sent an army to try to stimulate Canadian adherence to the American side. But the Canadians resolutely refused to do so. And although there have been periodic crises in Canadian history ever since, on every occasion, peaceful procedural resolution of the problems have kept the Canadians politically stable as Britain. Now, I've argued in this course that the 2 greatest changes in Anglo-American conservatism since the 18th century have been its reconciliation with capitalist economics and its reconciliation with democracy in politics. I pointed out in several of the early lectures that industrial capitalists seemed like more of a threat than a support to British traditional life in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The new industrial factories of the 1700s offered an entirely new kind of work, alien, mechanised and noisy. And the industrialists' preference for free trade was at first anathema to the landed classes, who saw it quite reasonably as a threat to their own privileged position. So the great political conflicts of the early 19th century in Britain revolved around the confrontation between two types of wealth: landed wealth, the aristocratic tradition on the one hand, and industrial wealth on the other. And in the course I described the controversy over the First Reform Act of 1832, whose significance was that it was going to revise the way in which parliamentary seats were apportioned, revise the way in which members were elected to Parliament, and in doing so respond to changes in the population and changes in the economy. It was going to take into account the fact that Britain was becoming a more industrialised nation and give representation to those people. It still wasn't turning Britain into a democracy, but nevertheless it was going along a road which would eventually lead to democratisation. That was the first of those crises in 1832, and the second, which came in 1846, was the repeal of the Corn Laws, when Robert Peel, despite the bitter and divisive unpopularity of the decision, recognised the value of repealing the privileged status of the British farmers by getting rid of these duties which kept British food prices artificially high, and in doing so opened up markets to freer trade, whose long-term beneficiaries would be the industrialists. So writers who now belong in the conservative bookshelf, like Adam Smith, the author of An Inquiry into the Wealth of Nations, once belonged only in the bookshelves of the radicals. And Smith and the early capitalists were called radicals. Since then, logically, once you think it through, they gradually became conservative. After the 1850s, the landed and the industrial sections of British society came to terms with each other and laid the economic foundations of modern conservatism. Commercial and industrial wealth encountered fewer opponents in America because they did not have to displace a powerful and entrenched landed aristocracy. Although even there, in the early 1800s, the conflict between the southern Jeffersonians on the one hand and the northern Hamiltonians on the other, with Hamilton advocating a more commercial and industrial future for America, is something like an American transfiguration of that same kind of dispute. The slave-owning planters of the South are only a partial exception to this rule, however, because they also owed their prosperity to the invention of spinning and weaving machines in Britain and the transatlantic cotton trade. In other words, although a lot of the slave-owning plantation Southerners thought of themselves in terms of Walter Scott's Ancient Gentlemen and even called themselves Cavaliers, nevertheless, they were parts of an industrialising world. The demand for cotton would not have been so high had it not been for the industrialisation of the cotton manufacturing process in Britain. And these plantation owners were tied into an international trade network. By the 1870s, conservatism in America was fully compatible with advocacy of the free market and industry, as the work of William Graham Sumner and Andrew Carnegie demonstrated. The elites of both Britain and the United States resisted the spread of democracy because, as they saw it, democracy destroyed the benign social hierarchy and because it corrupted republican virtue while enabling demagogues to thrive. I can't emphasise too strongly the fact, which is so easy to forget these days, that when the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution, they didn't think that they were creating a democracy. Edmund Burke in England and the American Federalists were as shocked at the idea that poor and uneducated people should vote as we would be by the idea that the poor and the uneducated should perform intricate surgical operations. To them it seemed absolutely incomprehensible that that kind of concession might be made. Now, one of the great challenges of historical study, and surely also one of the things which makes historical study so interesting, is to take seriously the fact that in different times and places, people believed things to be right that we believe to be wrong, and that they held their beliefs with the same confidence and intensity that we hold ours. We have to suspend our judgment if we are to understand them, and if we're not to condescend to them. In other words, in the study of history, we're constantly having to, at least for a moment, climb into other people's shoes. We need to get into the shoes of the slave owners who believed that slavery was right. That doesn't mean that we have to agree that slavery was right, but we've got to at least provisionally be able to think that kind of thought. Here's why they said slavery was right, and actually go through the arguments, and if we can, even understand what gave emotional intensity to those kinds of feelings. Just as then we also have to get into the shoes of the slave to see how the situation seemed from their point of view, and then into the shoes of the abolitionist, and then into the shoes of the northerner who was anti-slavery but also anti-abolitionist, another of the surprising points of view that we encountered along the way. Remember this also, it's too easy for us to think of democracy as somehow natural, as somehow the default position, but it isn't. Democracy is a very unusual historical achievement. It's still extremely delicate in many parts of the world. For example, the ex-Soviet states, which became democracies for the first time in the 1990s. And it's already failed in many parts of post-colonial Africa, where in most cases democracy existed briefly after the colonial powers departed, but then failed and has been replaced by dictatorships. We also need to remember, this is important too, how much poorer and how much more ignorant the poor and the ignorant were than they are now. When people were rejecting the idea that the lower classes should vote, the lower classes were people who'd horrify us. The lower classes in Britain before 1850 hardly ever washed. Usually they just owned one set of clothes and wore them till they were worn out and never washed them. Couldn't read, were turbulent and menacing in crowds, spoke an almost completely different language from the upper classes, and certainly were not capable of mature reflection on the political issues of their day. Poverty wasn't quite so acute in America, but conditions weren't so different in the early 19th century America either. These were the people, when elitists resisted votes for the masses, those are the people whom they were resisting. Such episodes that we've mentioned in the course as the Bank War and the rise of Andrew Jackson appeared to members of the elites to support their worst fears. When Andrew Jackson was inaugurated, there was a great surging rabble at the White House reception when President Jackson opened it to all comers. He pandered to class antagonism in vetoing the renewal of the bank and horrified members of the elites in doing so, people who gathered around the new Whig Party. Conservatives found it easy to scoff at the idea of women as voters because it was something new and because it appeared to challenge deeply held views about appropriate gender roles. It was as easy for them to scoff as it would be for us now to scoff at opponents of women's suffrage. I think this is clearly a case where, once a reform has taken place, it at once becomes difficult to imagine the point of view of the people who'd resisted that reform, especially when in practice anxious fears that it's going to be terribly dangerous are almost at once nullified. Women getting the votes didn't at all upset the equilibrium of society, didn't rob women of their distinctive feminine characteristics. And it wasn't long before people on both sides of the Atlantic started noticing that if you could distinguish women's from men's votes at all, the women tended to be voting in a slightly more conservative way. Well, brilliant politicians and writers on both sides of the Atlantic reconciled conservatism with democracy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Abraham Lincoln with the Gettysburg Address. It's a eulogy to democracy. Theodore Roosevelt with his faith that the common man can respond to his high faith in selfless idealism, the warrior virtues and the dignity of the individual. In Britain, the sponsorship of the Second Reform Act by Benjamin Disraeli, the Conservative Prime Minister. As I said at the time, this is one of the most baffling puzzles of British political history. Why did Disraeli get behind legislation which appeared to be moving Britain further down the road to democracy when his party was the party which had the most principled objections to it? I'm not saying that this is a controversy that can be completely solved, but I think it's reasonable to suggest that Disraeli had a fine idea of what was probably coming and how to make necessary concessions along the way. Of course, in the British case, each Reform Act made each subsequent Reform Act that much more likely by establishing the principle of reform and the implicit goal of universal democracy. One of the most intriguing contributions to the debate about whether Britain should become a democracy and what the relationship is between Democracy and Tradition was made by the journalist and controversialist G.K. Chesterton. And I'd like to read you a passage from his book Orthodoxy, written in 1908, in which he makes the claim, you might think that democracy is one option and adherence to tradition is another. But actually, that's not true. They really go together beautifully. Chesterton's a lovely, knew how to manipulate paradox in a beautiful way, and he never did it better than here. Here's what he says. Tradition may be defined as an extension of the franchise. Tradition means giving votes to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. It is the democracy of the dead. Tradition refuses to submit to the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about. All Democrats object to men being disqualified by the accident of birth. Tradition objects to their being disqualified by the accident of death. Democracy tells us not to neglect a good man's opinion, even if he is our groom. Tradition asks us not to neglect a good man's opinion, even if he is our father. I, at any rate, cannot separate the two ideas of democracy and tradition. Well, that's a clever and beautiful passage. Of course, it was coming from the days in which a wealthy man might have a groom, the man who looks after his horses. And he's making the point, good ideas come from surprising places, from members of the lower classes and from the past. So that's an attempt by Chesterton to reconcile tradition with democracy, which in fact Britain and the United States were then both doing. Conservative leaders discovered and then made use of the potency of deference and emulation. Working class people wanted the vote, and while some of them became Labour socialists, many others became conservatives. That is, they accepted the principle of social hierarchy and the sense of duty to those below them on the social ladder and deference to those above them. When they made gradual gains in security and wealth over the course of the 20th century, they sought to emulate the way of life of their social superiors. And even those who identified with the Labour movement were often what's called small c conservatives. In other words, not members of the capital C Conservative Party, but small c conservatives. Margaret Thatcher found that the trade unions were extraordinarily resistant to change. They were very touchy about their internal hierarchies and about their own traditions, about seniority within the union. In other words, there's a universal propensity to hold on to what is familiar. If you can let me just give a personal anecdote for a second here, I remember so clearly that growing up in England, I was born in 1956 and so was a child in the 60s and a teenager in the 1970s. Nobody ever said to me, we're all equal. The whole possibility of equality simply never rose. The assumption in my family and in the community around me was that there was a hierarchy, and that by and large it was a benevolent hierarchy. We knew who was above us and we knew who was below us. We knew what our responsibilities were and we knew what our duties were. And we lived in a world where the question of equality didn't come up very much, but there wasn't a burning sense of resentment on the part of people in the lower social classes because they felt that they'd been born to those places and that they had their own dignity and that that's where they belonged. Now, another of the surprises of this course, or of 20th century history, perhaps I should say, is that conservatism outlived mass religiosity in Britain. From Hooker, one of the very earliest intellectuals we looked at in the days of Queen Elizabeth I, to Edmund Burke, to Disraeli, the Church of England looked like a vital support to social and political stability. But in the event, the secularisation of Britain did not diminish its people's conservatism. Religion and conservatism often do go hand in hand, as American experience with the New Christian Right suggests. But they are separable. That's one of the surprises of the last 200 years. Now, in foreign affairs and world affairs, conservatism was vindicated in its confrontation with communism and in its ability to attract members of the rising middle classes in both countries. The conflict between liberal democracy and communism was perhaps the greatest conflict of the entire 20th century. Communism was based on the hope of a transformation of human nature. The communists, the Marxists, were perhaps over-optimistic in thinking that self-interest is attributable only to life in capitalist society, rather than that it's a deep and ineradicable characteristic of human nature. Certainly, the most optimistic of the communists hoped that when capitalism had been completely defeated, the state would wither away Everybody would be free. The full human character would express itself perfectly. Everybody would be taller, healthier, more intelligent, and have a wider array of interests. That was the hope. But of course, in practice, communism was embattled from the outset, and it was linked to the long Russian tradition of autocracy. So it soon became ruthless and repressive in practice. Karl Marx himself had never expected Russia to be the first communist nation. He thought it was going to be Britain or France or the United States, countries where industrialisation was far more advanced. He'd also expected the working class to be ground down into steadily more misery. But in fact, the working classes under industrial capitalism throughout the West experienced an increase of wealth, so much so that you can't find anyone in America today who'll even admit to being a member of the working class, and it's becoming rarer and rarer in Britain too. It is intriguing to speculate on the history of communism if Britain had undergone the first communist revolution. It would almost certainly have been accompanied by monarchy and cricket and cups of tea. But of course, as I've suggested throughout this course, the idea of a communist revolution in Britain was extremely unlikely because of Britain's immense political stability, the power of tradition, and the widely shared agreement on the fundamentals of political life. Even in the desperate days of the First World War, pacifism, defeatism, and advocacy of revolution were numerically tiny, whereas they shattered the Tsar's regime in Russia, opening up the possibilities to Lenin. A wide agreement in the United States about the need to contain the Soviet threat between 1945 and the late 1980s brought the Cold War to a successful close without the use of nuclear weapons. And it's worth stressing here that Republicans and Democrats alike, for the most part, agreed on this policy. The policy of containment was first outlined by George Kennan, a Truman Democrat, in 1946. But by and large, both parties stuck to it for decades after that. There was a certain amount of disagreement, but only around the edges. In other words, periodically, Republicans advocated rollback, pushing back the communist lines as a possibility in flashpoints like the Korean and Vietnamese War. But the constant awareness of the need for restraint, because of the danger of nuclear war, kept both parties in a fairly consistent bipartisan foreign policy. And it's appropriate to think of that as a shared conservative consensus. The Soviet Union became more cynical, more repressive, fell ever further behind in productivity, and was ultimately left with no one believing in its ideology at all, and a great yearning behind the Iron Curtain for the kind of life that was being enjoyed in the West beyond that curtain, both material and psychological. For much of the 20th century, the eventual triumph of some kind of socialism had seemed to be inevitable. But suddenly, after 1990, even that was no longer true. Well, despite recent electoral reversals in America and the Conservative Party's long visit to the wilderness in Britain, it's reasonable to anticipate a long future for conservatism in both countries. As people get richer, they tend to become more conservative simply because they have more to lose. Widespread enrichment is one of the great themes of 20th century history, and it ought to have, and it has had, a conservatizing effect. There's also a propensity to become more conservative as you get older. And life expectancy has increased dramatically in both countries, again creating ever larger cohorts of ageing people who are also the most likely to be the most conservative. Well, even after 36 lectures, 18 hours of it, there's still much more I could say, more characters and more details. But I hope you'll agree that this series has included enough to give you an introduction to the main ideas and history of conservatism in the English-speaking world. If you've watched or listened from start to finish, I thank you for your sustained attention.